All right, I think we're live. I'm hoping we're live. Chris, are we live?
I believe we are live.
We are live, and this is awesome. So, hey, everybody, this is Brant from the Armchair Dragoons. I am just really here to introduce Chris and thank him profusely for joining us again at another ACDC with what I'm sure is going to be another fantastic talk, because I've never heard Chris do a bad one. That's not a challenge, Chris. Please don't make this the one. But yeah, I'm going to say hi and I'm going to get out of the way and I'm going to let him take the time that he needs. I do want to let folks know we can take comments either in the chat or over in the in Discord or in the YouTube chat, either way. Chris, I think this is your show, dude.
Hey, Brant, I don't think we're showing up on YouTube.
How are we not showing up on YouTube? How is that?
There we go. There we go. Now it's showing up.
Oh, man. I have no idea what went wrong there. Either way, I think we're in the right place at this point. So I'm going to let you take over and I'm going to totally mute me.
Roger that. I think I know what happened there. Let's have a conversation later and we'll talk about it. Hello, everybody. I am Chris Weuve. As you can see from the slide, I am the founder of the Society for the Conservation of Angular Momentum. What that means in this particular case is that I am not speaking for any employer, past, present, or future. I am speaking for myself. That is the moniker that I use when I am speaking for myself. Now, as it turns out, I really am the founder of something called the Society for the Conservation of Angular Momentum. It started off as a joke on a mailing list because I just thought it would be make a funny sig, because I just had this image that somebody who didn't understand science somewhere would be in favor of conserving angular momentum because it's conservation and therefore would be a good thing. But without ever actually understanding what it is. So I am indeed the the founder of the Society for the Conservation of Angular Momentum. I'm here to talk with you today about Starship Troopers, both the book and the movie. I will warn you in advance that this presentation is riddled with spoilers. So if you have not yet read the 62-year-old book or seen the 23-year-old movie, 24-year-old movie at this point almost, it is your responsibility for being spoiled in all of this. I'm going to go ahead and do it. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about, oops, it helps to have the focus in the right app. Let's talk about who I am. So I'm a naval analyst and war game designer, although I'm not really doing the former in the current time period. I was a researcher at the Center for Naval Analysis, where I worked for Peter Pearl on the war game design team. I was then a member of the research faculty of the Naval War College, where I was a assistant professor of wargaming. I spent 9 years an intelligence analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency, and I currently work for another part of DoD, but the agreement is I don't speak for them and they don't speak for me, and so I'm not going to tell you exactly where it is that I work. I got into this because I'm a longtime gamer and I'm a longer time science fiction fan, and I've been a fan of Starship Troopers since back in the high school era. I think I was a sophomore in high school when I first read Starship Troopers. My library didn't have it. I had to request it on interlibrary loan, and I sat down and burned through it in an afternoon and loved it, and later ended up getting a copy of the book myself. I did a web page on Starship Troopers back about the time that the movie came out because I'd been involved in a lot of mailing list discussions, and I sort of took all those and put those together as a web page. And I've been cited about Starship Troopers a lot. There was a time period where I could have told you that I got about 1 email a week from that web page. That's no longer the case, but that was pretty steady for about 10 years. And I'm also a guy who volunteers to do a bunch of stuff. So I'm here today because I'm a guy who volunteers to do a bunch of stuff. I'm also here to talk with you what my opinion is, give you some thoughts on both Robert Heinlein's book, Starship Troopers, and Paul Verhoeven's movie, Starship Troopers. And you'll note that I kind of refer to, when I say Starship Troopers, I'm usually talking about the book. When I say Paul Verhoeven's Starship Troopers, I'm really talking about the movie. So first, before I get into the meat of the talk, let's do a few caveats. As I've said a couple of times already, my opinions only. These are not the opinions of Brant or the Armchair Dragoons or any past, present, or future employee. I'd also say there's a lot of room for discussion here. I'm giving you an overview about this. I'd love to actually do a longer work on it. I'd love to do an annotated version of the book where some of this stuff gets explained, and it would also include some essays and stuff in the back about the book, because there have been some very good commentary on the book. There's also been some very bad commentary, but there has been some very good commentary, and I'd like to collect it all in one place. Haven't gotten around to doing that yet. So the next thing is, let's go through an outline. And I don't know why it keeps putting the background image on this slide as non-transparent, because I changed it yet this morning to make it transparent, but it doesn't seem to actually save. So my apologies for this slide being a little difficult to read. I'm going to give you an introduction and background about the book. First part of this talk is going to focus on the book. I'm then going to give you a brief overview of the plot, talk about some of the controversies surrounding it, give you my opinion about those controversies, which are, I call misperceptions, and my corrections to those misperceptions, and then give you my opinion about what I think the book is actually really about. Then I'm going to shift over and talk about the movie as a translation of the book and as a movie in its own right, and then my conclusions on the movie. So like I said before, this presentation is absolutely positively riddled with spoilers. So be aware of that. So I should slow down because I got a lot of time. If you've got questions, go ahead and put your questions in the chat, and I will try to get to them at the end of the talk. So please feel free to ask whatever you'd like me to talk about in this. So a little introduction and background about the book. So it was first published in 1959, and it won the Hugo Award in 1959 for Best Novel. It was written in a white-hot fury over the course of about 6 weeks in response to an Eisenhower administration policy that Heinlein did not approve of. And it was some sort of test ban, nuclear test ban of some sort. And so Heinlein put aside the book that he was working on, which I believe was Stranger in a Strange Land, which didn't come out until like 1968. So he must not have been very far on that. He put that aside and sat down and just wrote this in a white-hot fury. And that had implications, I would argue, which we'll come to later. It was then serialized as Starship Soldier in the magazine of science, fantasy and science fiction. I'd like to tell you what the difference is between the serialized version and the published version are, but I've never actually read the serialized version, so I don't know what the differences are. But it was serialized. He intended it as a juvenile. He had written 6 juveniles for Scribner at this point. He gave it to Scribner as a juvenile. Scribner rejected it because there was violence in it. Now, the violence is relatively abstract. There's no sort of description of gore. There's no description of blood or anything like that. But the main character does kill aliens, including some humanoid aliens, and there are people that are killed. Actually, I guess there is a description of blood in talking about some of the humans that are damaged. And so Scribner rejected it. And Heinlein, who can best be described as prickly, immediately ended his relationship with Scribner and never submitted to them again, told them off and stopped publishing juveniles. And then from that point on, strictly published novels that he considered to be adult novels and went with other publishers. So this book had a lot of implications for Heinlein's career. It was his first full-length adult novel. He had done adult short stories, a lot of them, and then he had written juvenile novels, and now from this point on, he started doing adult novels. As of yesterday, a book written in 1959 has garnered 5,255 ratings for an average of 4.6 stars on Amazon. That is phenomenal that a 60-year-old book is still getting lots and lots of new reviews. When I first started tracking those reviews, it was probably around 2,000 reviews. So it's still getting reviews 60 some years after it was published, which is really pretty phenomenal. It's also inspired some works in other media. There have been 3 live action and 2 animated movies. Actually, I think I need to change that to 3 animated movies because I messed around with this slide a little bit, and I believe it's, in fact, I'm positive, it's a total of 3 animated movies, 2 of which are sort of sequels to the live action movies that were done starting in 1997. One of them was a movie going back to the 1980s that was done in Japan that I believe was like the first half of the book, and then the second half never came out. And I believe that one is actually more faithful to the book than the other ones, but I've never seen a copy of that movie for sale in the US, let alone actually seen it. I should go looking for it. There was an animated series that sort of split the difference between the book and the movie versions. It had powered armor in a way that the movies didn't, but it was really more the setup of the movie version. There's been a couple of video games. There's been a role-playing miniatures game done by Mongoose that was based, it's kind of, if you had to say it was based on anything, you'd say it was based on the animated series. There's been a couple of board war games, one that came out about the time of the movie, and it was really more focused on the movie, and then a classic by Avalon Hill that was basically Panzer Blitz in space. There's been some comic books, and there was a make-your-own-adventure type book. So it's generated a lot of follow-on media over the years. It's also generated a lot of arguments, and tons of mail for Heinlein, which he said was mostly negative, which is interesting because it's a book that's got a 4.6 rating on Amazon. So the opinion of that book has clearly changed over the years, or maybe it just says more about people who email about or send mail about books. Most of the email that I got over the years on my webpage was very positive email. So it's interesting sort of comparing that, but he said that most of it was negative. This presentation is the direct result of some of these arguments that occurred. Like I said, this started off as comments I made on a science fiction mailing list, basically in response to a couple of people. There was one person in particular who was making all sorts of ridiculous claims about Heinlein in general and the book in specific. And it was me coming back and saying, no, that's not true at all. That's not even remotely true. And me sort of explaining the stuff as I saw it. And that's really sort of how this all got started. That's how my webpage got started, and that's how this got started. So now let's take a little bit of a look at the plot. I'll give you an overview summary of the plot. So the book opens with the protagonist, Juan Rico, participating in a raid on a planet of some enemies known as the Skinnies. Now, the Terran Federation, I'll note this is several years before Star Trek, so you can't claim that the Star Trek folks can't claim that the idea of a federation goes back to Star Trek. It actually predates Heinlein's book in terms of an interstellar federation. But the Terran Federation is at war with 2 alien races. One is known as the bugs, the arachnids. They look like giant spiders. And there's they have some co-belligerents on their side that are nicknamed the Skinnies. And you never get any other name for them in this book as to what they're called. And the book opens with Juan Rico just about to be dropped on the Skinny planet to participate in a raid. He goes on the raid. He survives unhurt. Some members of his team are killed. They get off the planet. And then it immediately goes back to an extended flashback to his decision to join the mobile infantry, his basic training in his early career, and eventually it sort of moves past the point at the opening of the book. Juan really joins the Terran Federation mobile infantry on a whim over the objections of his parents. His best friend is going to join, and he just sort of goes along and decides to join too. He goes to a very tough boot camp and becomes very tough himself. It's worth pointing out that the boot camp here is totally unlike how the US does boot camp, and that there's a lot of what would be considered A-school type training that goes along with it. It's specifically a boot camp for the mobile infantry. So they get all their, basically when you finish this boot camp, you are ready to go off to an active duty unit and start fighting. So there isn't this like plethora of schools that you go to after boot camp, and it lasts like 9 months long. He then goes to a combat unit, and as his first drop, they are dropped on Klendathu, which is the Bugs' home planet, and it's an attempt to sort of end the war quickly. It is, shall we say, ill-conceived and does not go well. He almost dies. He manages to get off the planet after it goes to hell in a handbasket, and he goes to another unit. He's now an experienced veteran who's been through hell. He ends up going career. He reconciles with his father, who he had had a very severe break with when he decided to join. He attends officer candidate school, and he participates in a very important operation as a junior officer under instruction. And then the book ends with Juan leading his old unit during an invasion back to the Bugs' home planet, presumably near the end of the war. They've learned a lot, and this time they're going to do it right. And the book ends right before he drops on the planet. And it's his old unit with his father as his leading sergeant, and they're going to end the war. So, sounds kind of exciting, right? But where's the controversy? The controversy isn't really about the science fiction parts of it. It's not really about the war. It's about, okay, hold on a second. There we go. The controversy is really about the political situation that all this is embedded in. There's a lot of issues that are discussed in the context of this high school class that Juan had that he keeps doing flashbacks to, called History and Moral Philosophy. It's a class that everyone is required to take, although there are no grades. And it explains why in the Terran Federation only veterans can vote or hold certain jobs. So basically, there are residents of the Terran Federation and there are citizens of the Terran Federation. And if you do not volunteer for some sort of federal service, you are not able to be a citizen, you're not able to be a cop, you're not able to do certain other jobs. He also talks about how corporal punishment in the form of public lashings is a standard punishment for some crimes. For instance, drunk driving is 50 lashes. In the book, at one point during basic training, there's a character who's quote unquote almost executed for quote unquote a minor offense. And there's a reason those words are in quotes. We're going to talk about them a little bit. As far as the public lashings go, Heinlein really believed in quick punishment. I mean, that's one of the things that he talks about, is that it's not drawn out. You don't have this thing where like your trial is 6 months in the future. They basically get it over with. A lot of people have said that this universe is not particularly, how do you get there? How does this happen? And to which my response is, Starship Troopers is a classic what if story. It's the it couldn't really happen argument is irrelevant. There's a fine science fiction tradition of using what if stories as vehicles and like this. For instance, Philip Jose Farmer did a book called Day World, where the idea is that to solve overpopulation, everybody lives 1 day a week and they're in suspended animation for the other 6 days a week. And nobody thinks that that's really a serious policy proposal. So it sort of baffles me that people think that this is somehow a serious policy proposal on Heinlein's part. Some of the things that make this even worse, even more controversial, is that the book is really inconsistent. And if you remember, I said that if you go, that he wrote it in a white-hot fury, and that had implications. I think that if this book had had a longer gestation period, some of those inconsistencies might have gone away. Heinlein's public statements about the book are also inconsistent. He says stuff that just simply is not true. We don't know why it isn't true, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And those inconsistencies fuel the fire. In fact, I would argue that in some ways those inconsistencies create the space in which most of the controversies thrive. Because in a lot of places, people just assume the worst because of the inconsistencies. I would argue that if you pull out your magnifying glass, you look at the evidence in some detail, et cetera, you can actually reach pretty clear conclusions that largely negate some of the complaints that people have, that largely dispel some of those misperceptions. So let's take a look at those misperceptions. I'm going to look at 4 of them because I really don't have time to go into a lot more depth. Those 4 misperceptions are, first of all, that the Terran Federation is a military dictatorship. Second, that the term federal service necessarily means military service. Third, that Federation citizens are basically mostly male, that Federation citizenship is male dominated, and as a result, it's a misogynistic society. And fourth, that the section with Ted Hendrick and his court-martial shows the injustice of the entire system because his punishment was too harsh and, quote unquote, only a loophole prevented him from being executed for a situation and it would have been wildly disproportional. So I'm going to go through and take a look at all these one at a time, starting off with the Terran Federation is a military dictatorship. So that's the claim. That it's a military dictatorship, that it's inherently militaristic, and that the establishment has a vested interest in starting wars. There's some assumptions here that would have to be true for that statement to be true, and those assumptions are that the military is in charge of the government, that the government is a dictatorship, that follows, and that the government and people act in a specifically warlike manner, that they're really trying to start wars. My assessment is that the claims are not really supported by the book. Specifically, it says that military personnel are forbidden from holding office or even voting. You are not a citizen if you are in the military. You are acquiring your citizenship, but you become a citizen when you leave the military, when you are discharged, when you are honorably discharged from the military, or you medical out of the military. In order to be an officer, you actually have to be career. So you have to spend your entire, career, 20 years plus. They never really define how long a career term is. You have to be career in order to be an officer, and as a result, that just pushes down the time period until which you have the rights and duties of citizenship, including voting, including holding public office. So by definition, they're not even allowed to vote. You have characters that are actively hostile to federal service. Juan's father in particular is hostile at the beginning of the book, and he's not shy about saying that he's hostile to federal service. Now, it is worth pointing out, he says those words to his son in the comfort of his own home. Is he out protesting on street corners? Probably not. So, I'm pretty cool with the idea of somebody saying it doesn't really count what you say indoors, it's what you're willing to say in public. Okay, fair enough. I don't know if he's going on the 23rd century equivalent of Facebook and posting screeds against the citizenship policy. So fair enough. But it is worth pointing out that limitations on the franchise are common throughout history. We have limitations here. If you're a felon, you can't vote. There's age restrictions. You have to be born in the US or go through a citizenship class and become a naturalized American citizen. We don't just let anybody vote, and our restrictions are relatively few and far between compared to, say, ancient Athens, the sort of the epitome of the creation of democracy. In ancient Athens, only male citizens could vote. So no women could vote. And it's even worse than it sounds because you did not get citizenship just by living in Athens or even being born in Athens. Your family could have lived in Athens for 3 generations, but you're not technically an Athenian because you came from someplace else. So in the city-state of Athens, it's estimated that the number of citizens is around 4,000 or 5,000 usually. It's a very small group. And, they're all citizens and they all have a right to participate in the process, but it's a very small amount of people. So there's always been limitations on the franchise, and this society is no different. There's no hint in the book that this is a dictatorship, none whatsoever. Now, we'll contrast that with the movie later on, but in the book, there's no hint that it's a dictatorship, not even remotely. And there's no hint that the government is especially warlike in that it seeks out wars. It is clearly a society that amongst the people that are citizens, they understand that you have to be prepared to go to war, and that the best way to prevent that wars are things that occur, and that the best way to prevent a war is from being prepared for it. As somebody who's worked for DoD for the last 20 years, I'm fairly sympathetic to that view. And that doesn't mean that it's especially warlike. I know a lot of people in uniform that really, really don't like the idea of going to war. A few caveats, like I said, the feasibility of the system is another thing entirely. This is really a what-if story, way more than it is a serious suggestion that we could get from where we are now to there. Does it make sense that it could happen? I don't know. That's really kind of besides the point. The author has the right to sort of say, here's the situation that's been created. Mr. Dubois describes a different political philosophy than the U.S. has, but it's also clear that many don't share it. It's a relatively small minority, relatively speaking, although he does talk about citizenship rates in various places. They go from just a few percentage points in some places to 80% on other planets, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we get down the road. So, if this is a dictatorship, they're really not very good at it. So let's talk about federal service equals military service. The claim is either that federal service is exclusively military, or that federal service includes a lot of non-military jobs. Those are really kind of the options here. So which one is it? The answer appears to lie somewhere in between. Now, Heinlein claims, remember I said that Heinlein is inconsistent about this. Heinlein says that, quote, in Starship Troopers, it is stated flatly and more than once that 19 out of 20 veterans are not military veterans, but former members of federal civil service. Heinlein's wrong. It doesn't say that flatly. It doesn't say that more than once. It's just not in there, period. He said that in an interview that was published as an essay in a book of writings. Basically, it was a phone conversation that Jim Bain had with Heinlein that later was transcribed and published as a Heinlein essay. And it's just not in there. And the evidence that we see doesn't support the claim. James Gifford, in his essay, The Nature of Federal Service in Robert A. Heinlein, Starship Troopers, says, the evidence in the text of Starship Troopers is overwhelmingly in favor of the exclusively military and support interpretation of federal service. The only contrary evidence is sparse, vague, and subject to varying interpretation. Gifford goes on to say, I believe that Heinlein's statement was for federal service to be only 5% military, and that in the haste and fury of writing it, and due to the nature of the protagonist's service, the supporting statements were left out or inadvertently edited out. I would argue that it is perhaps the case that he's being a little generous with Heinlein. I think it might be the case that Heinlein is responding to all that criticism he got. I think that, or it may be the case that Heinlein is just trying to put some spin on it. Might just be that Heinlein's being prickly. Might be that he meant it, it's unclear. But that book was written in a white-hot fury, and there wasn't a chance to, presumably wasn't a full chance to go back and edit it. Maybe if he had spent a little bit more time, there'd be more stuff there. Now, it is stated flatly and more than once that the government has to take you unless you are not able to understand the oath or have a criminal record, which is a big change from the current military. The current military can just say, look, you don't meet the physical standards. They have to find something for you to do. They have physical standards for particular jobs, and you don't necessarily get to pick your job. You get to put a preference down. You don't necessarily get to pick the job. And they have to keep you unless you're quit or dishonorably discharged. So specifically, Sergeant Ho, during the scene where Johnny and his friend Carl are trying to sign up, Sergeant Ho says, but if you want to serve and I can't talk you out of it, then we have to take you because that's your constitutional right. It says that everybody, male or female, should have his born right to pay his service and assume full citizenship. But the facts are that we are getting hard pushed to find things for all volunteers to do that aren't just glorified KP. You can't all be real military men, note military men, military people at least. We don't need that many, and most of the volunteers aren't #1 soldier material anyhow. We've had to think of a whole list of dirty, nasty, dangerous jobs that will at the very least make them remember for the rest of their lives their citizenship is valuable to them because they've paid a high price for it. A term of service is either real military service, rough and dangerous even in peacetime, or a most unreasonable facsimile thereof. Note, though, that Sergeant Ho is trying to discourage one from joining the military. And that's actually something that's very interesting. Every time he talks to somebody about joining, they try to talk him out of it. They are not pulling people in. They're not trying to get people to join. They are actively pushing them away. They want people that are motivated to get their citizenship, that are motivated to be in, to be part of it. So that's actually something that makes it interesting when trying to interpret all of this, is that it's clear that a lot of these characters have an agenda, and that agenda is trying to hold people, try to talk people out of it. But it is clear, in fact, in one case, somebody says something like, what are you volunteering for, labor battalions? But that's the only place we ever hear about labor battalions. It's not clear whether he's serious or not when he says labor battalions. Okay, one way or the other. It is clear that the only way that you can be permanently prevented from getting full citizenship is because you aren't allowed to sign up because you're incapable of understanding the oath. You aren't allowed to sign up because you have a criminal record. You are honorably discharged or dishonorably discharged. You quit or you die. Those are the only ways that prevent you from getting citizenship. That actually, if you think about it, that's not particularly restrictive. I mean, yeah, there's some conditions put on it, but most of those conditions are conditions that you, the person seeking citizenship, control. They're not conditions that are put on. They're not, they're barriers to be overcome, but you get to decide whether you want to overcome those barriers. So, yeah, somebody just said, what about the blind paraplegic counting hairs on a caterpillar example of federal service? Sergeant Ho makes the comment that we'll find something for you to do. We'll find something for you to do. And he emphasizes we'll make it nasty and hard, et cetera, et cetera. And he talks about testing spacesuits in Titan. It's mighty chilly on Titan. And a lot of times new space equipment has problems and, you could die. It's interesting, though, like I said, you've got this juxtaposition between it's clear that they're not coddling anybody. This boot camp that he goes to be a member of the mobile infantry is really, really tough. I could never get through that boot camp at the best of my days a long time ago. And I couldn't have done it at 18, I don't think. But it's also clear you've got other jobs. Like he runs into a guy that failed out of boot camp. They carried him off on a stretcher, and he refused to accept the medical because he wanted to be a citizen, and he ended up as a cook on a transport. Okay, so what exactly did they do to cooks? Make them work long hours? I don't know. So it's clear that they, on the one hand, it can be rough. The military can be that way. But on the other hand, they have to take you. And as long as you're just unwilling to say no, they have to keep you. They have to keep you. All right, so let's talk about the misogyny aspect, the alleged misogyny aspect about whether, okay, once again, let's make it work. About whether Federation citizenship is male dominated. That's the claim, that the majority of voters are male because women cannot volunteer for the MI or most other jobs described, and there are no women officers outside of the Navy, since no one can become an officer unless he is a combat veteran, and women cannot be members of combat units. Well, that's actually just plain wrong. We see a very small subset of the Army in this. We see only really in any detail the mobile infantry, and we learn a little bit about the K-9 Corps, and we learn a little bit about combat engineers and a special unit that has like psychics in it. That's pretty much what we get. We know that there's a bunch of other stuff, but that's really only what we know. and that restriction about MI and combat veterans to be officers and all that, that's all the MI, that's all the mobile infantry. We don't even know that applies to the rest of the Army. So we know that there are women officers in the Navy. And we also know that most pilots are female, because the belief is that they're just better at it. And so, given that military service is constitutionally guaranteed, as we talked about in the last slide, there has to be plenty of jobs with less demanding physical requirements, because you don't have to accept a medical. That's clear there. It has to be the case. And so let's do a little bit of a reality check. There is a discussion about the planet Iskandar, and the claim is that 80% of the population of the planet are citizens. Does that mean it's 80% male? That would seem a ridiculous claim. So I don't think that that's the case. It's worth pointing out the attrition rate for the mobile infantry. Juan Rico's regiment had started with 2,009 men. We graduated 187. Of the others, 14 were dead, 1 executed and his name struck, and the rest resigned, dropped, transferred, medical discharge, etc. So 90% plus washout rate. That's really pretty impressive. Note that transferred is included in that, though. So the ones that transferred went someplace else. We do not know how many of those people eventually became citizens. Okay, so let's talk about the big one, Ted Hendrick's court-martial. This is, I think, in some ways, the one that best illustrates the difference between the military mindset and the civilian mindset that's sort of in this book. And this is one that when I give this and there are veterans in the audience, they usually come up afterwards and say, yeah, that's exactly how it works in the US Army today, too. So the situation is that Ted Hendricks, one of the recruits, admits to striking a superior officer, which would be in Article 9080, and gets a field court-martial and a bad conduct discharge for violating this rule. The claims here are that Ted Hendrick's punishment was too harsh. He got 30 lashes, I think, or 10 lashes, or something like 10 lashes, I think. And also that he avoided the gallows, quote unquote, Hendrick avoided the gallows only because the field court didn't have the jurisdiction to assign greater punishment. My assessment is that the details are misunderstood here, that they're not seeing some things that are in between the lines there. And let's look at these separately a little bit. So the situation is that while still at boot camp, Johnny is on temporary light duty attached to the battalion commander's office. Sergeant Zim comes in sporting the signs of a developing black eye. With him is Ted Hendrick, another recruit, and 2 guards. Hendrick had disobeyed an order to freeze, which means take cover and don't move until release, and had refused administrative discipline, insisting on seeing the battalion commander, Captain Frankel. Zim relays the incident to Frankel, leaving out all mention of the source of the black eye, who then hands out his own administrative punishment. Hendrick protests the fairness of the punishment. Basically, Frankel threw the book at him and says, well, when Frankel says, okay, what do you think is unfair about this? Hendrick says, well, we were ordered to freeze and I hit the dirt and I found I was on this anthill. So I got to my knees to move over a couple of feet and I was hit from behind and knocked flat, and Zim yelled at me and I bounced up and popped him one, and at which point Frankel rockets out of his chair and says, "You struck your company commander?" And before Johnny knows it, there's a field court-martial that's convened, the evidence is heard, and Hendricks is sentenced to 10 lashes and a BCD. Okay, so let's look at the pieces of this. Was Ted Hendrick's punishment overly harsh? So it's clear when you read this scene, there's an extended conversation about it between Zim and Frankel. Zim and Frankel tried to handle the situation without resorting to a court-martial. They tried to keep it administrative. Zim does not mention the incident where he is hit by Hendrick. He just doesn't bring it up. He totally leaves it out of his report. Frankel's not dumb. He sees the fact that he's got a black eye. He knows what happened. Frankel doesn't mention it, but Hendrick forced an escalation. He could have quit if he really wanted out. He could have accepted the administrative punishment if he really wanted to stay in. But instead, he says in a room full of witnesses that he had committed a capital offense. And by capital, I mean that every week on Sunday, they list I think it's 21 crash landings or 31 crash landings. They are the things that have a death penalty punishment associated with them. And one of them is striking a superior officer. So at this point, Captain Frankel theoretically has a handful of options. One of them is he can ignore that outburst. Okay, what does that do to good order and discipline? He could let Hendrick quit. Same problem. What does that do to good order and discipline? He could remand Hendrick to a regular military court for a general court-martial, which we later discovered would have had pretty much no option other than to treat it like a capital offense. Or he could do what he chose to do, which was to convene a field court-martial against Hendrick. And it's clear that he did it specifically because the field court-martial did not have the jurisdiction to do anything worse than give him lashes and kick him out. Frankel basically says that later on, and one of the officers makes that comment to get it into the record, that he says, I only have the authority to do this. Why Captain Frankel chose to convene a field court-martial, I will not speculate. It's pretty clear he's sending a message to anybody who's reading that transcript exactly why that happened. So let's look at the second part of this claim, which I think really puts this in focus, and that is that Hendrick only avoided the gallows because of a loophole. Okay, let's turn this question on its head to really look at this. It's a capital offense. It's listed as a capital offense. They're told every week in formation that it's a capital offense, that you will hang by the neck until dead if you do this. Hendrick's heard this every week. Did that happen? No, he got off with a bad conduct discharge and 10 lashes. Why did that happen if it's a capital offense? And it's because the system is designed that way. The instructors, like the recruits, are citizen soldiers. They are there because they want to be there. They did not have to be there, and they do not want to enforce their will through terror. It's clear that if Captain Frankel, Sergeant Zim, or any of the other instructors who witnessed the altercation had wanted 10 Hendricks to hang, he would have. But the system puts no premium on executing recruits. Article 9080 is there to promote field discipline. They weren't really in the field, they were in training. There's no reason to actually do the full punishment, but they had to follow the standard procedure to make sure it didn't happen again. They had to send a message. It's clear that Frankel and Zim both did not want Hendrick to hang, and that they were doing everything they could to see that it didn't happen. Frankel says, "What do you think I was afraid of from the moment I saw you come in here sporting a shiner?" So let me back up for just a second. There's this part where Frankel and Zim are talking by themselves, but we know about it because Johnny is outside sitting on a chair in the hallway, and he's got his head back against the wall, and it's a very thin wall. So he's listening to the entire conversation. And he hears Frankel say, "What do you think I was afraid of from the moment I saw you come in here sporting a shiner? I did my best to brush it off with administrative punishment, and the young fool wouldn't let well enough alone. But I never thought he would be crazy enough to blurt it out that he hung one on you. He's stupid. You should have eased him out of the outfit weeks ago instead of nursing him along until he got into trouble. But blurt it out he did to me in front of witnesses, forcing me to take official notice of it, and that licked us." Now, I'll note, he said ease him out of the unit. He didn't say force him to quit. He said get him someplace else. He's not even saying that this kid shouldn't be a citizen. He's saying that he shouldn't be in the MI. Hanging him would have served no purpose. The article against, like I said, the article against striking a superior officer wasn't designed for the purpose of finding excuses to kill people. It was designed for the purpose of ensuring discipline in the field. Justice was adequately served by the punishment that Hendrick received and the extra vigilance on the part of the instructors, which teach those who didn't learn that particular lesson strongly enough. Frankel says, this weary mess isn't all lost. Any regiment of boots needs a stern lesson in the meaning of 9080, as we both know. They haven't yet learned to think, they won't read, and they rarely listen, but they can see. And young Hendrick's misfortune may save one of his mates someday from swinging by the neck until he's dead, dead, dead. Each and every instructor there, from the lowest corporal to the commanding general of the Training and Discipline Command, was at one time a recruit. They all understand the temptations and stresses that recruits are under, and they understand that it is incumbent upon them that such incidents never be allowed to happen. And they are trained to prevent that and deal with them should the need arise. I really, really suspect that this was a pre-planned response to this situation. This is exactly how the book says to handle this. Frankel wasn't making this up. He did what he was taught to do. And that was to call a field court-martial so they didn't have to hang this kid. I am 110% sure of that. And every military veteran who's ever talked with me about it is convinced of that too, because the US military, along with the Terran Federation military, has the principle that you keep the punishment at the lowest level that you can keep it, in particular to handle incidents like this. All right. So what's this book really about anyway? Purely my opinion, I don't think it's really a book about the military. I don't think it's about being a soldier or why we fight or how to set up a government or the relative capabilities of men and women or how to punish drunk driving or any of that. I think it's a book about civic virtue. It's a book about what distinguishes a citizen in the sense of one who recognizes that with rights come responsibilities and that the two are proportional from a non-citizen. Your mileage may vary. Now that we've talked about the book, let's talk about Paul Verhoeven's Starship Troopers. The one bad thing about doing this remotely is that when I do it in person, I never mention that first bullet about Melrose Place meets Triumph of the Will, which came from a review of the movie a long time ago. I just really, really like watching people read. I can tell who's reading the slides when people start reading. It was originally intended to be a non-Star Trek movie called Bug Hunt, but they discovered that the rights to Starship Troopers were available, so they bought the rights. And I haven't updated the legacy here because there's a whole bunch of stuff. You saw the legacy earlier on. Somebody said, that there's all these sequels because the original movie didn't suck enough. And there's all the different stuff I mentioned earlier. Plus, there's also a lot of angry Heinlein fans as a result of this. Let's talk about it as a translation of the book. Somebody once described it as being based on the back of a book by Robert Heinlein. That's actually a fairly good description of it. It's like, and it makes sense because Paul Verhoeven was actually proud of the fact that he didn't bother to read the book until after principal photography was finished because he didn't want it to contaminate his vision. He didn't want the source material to contaminate his vision. Yet they called it Starship Troopers and they used Robert Heinlein's name all over it. Whiskey Tango Foxtrot. They changed the focus from the evils of fascism, from civic duty to the evils of fascism. They changed all the dialogue. There's a lot of unimportant differences. I would argue that it would have been cool if they had the powered armor, but they didn't. I don't think that's really that important to getting at the core of either the movie or the book. There's a lot of character changes they add, they subtract, they combine, they do this, they do that. They had women in the mobile infantry. Okay, I'm cool with that. I don't really have a problem with that. There's a lot of philosophical differences that I would say actually do matter, though. That it's a fascist state vice a representative democracy. It's got the political philosophy to go along with being a fascist state. There's a lot of subtle changes, or not so subtle changes, to the dialogue from Mr. Dubois and others, where they will add words to change the meaning. They actively recruit. They are constantly trying to get people to join, vice discouraging people from joining. There's a complete lack of diversity, which is missing in the book. There's diversity all over the book. You find out that Juan is perhaps not a native. That several of the main characters are not native English speakers, for instance. But the movie basically looks like the Aryan edition of GQ. And there's a couple of examples I want to go into involving intentional sadism. So, in the first one, there's a training accident. Sergeant Zim starts things out by asking the assembled recruits, this is the very first day, if any of them think that they can beat him in a fight. And this recruit named Breckenridge tries to do so and is injured. And as presented in the book, the injury is clearly an accident. The big recruit was sitting on the ground, holding his left wrist in his right hand. He didn't say anything. Zim bent over him. Broken? Reckon it might be, sir. I'm sorry you hurried me a little. Do you know where the dispensary is? Never mind. Jones, take Breckenridge over to the dispensary. As they left, Zim slapped him on the right shoulder and said quietly, let's try it again in a month or so. I'll show you what happened. So it's clear that Zim respects Breckenridge for trying to beat him in a fight, and that it was an accident. He wasn't trying to hurt this kid. He was trying to train him. And it was an accident. In the movie, in Paul Verhoeven's Starship Troopers, it plays out very differently. Zim has Breckenridge pinned. The fight is over, and he deliberately breaks his wrist. The second scene takes place sometime later. Zim and the recruits are practicing with throwing knives when one of the recruits, as it happens, Ted Hendricks, so this takes place before the court-martial, asks, what possible use is learning how to use throwing knives when one professor type can do so much more just by pushing a button? In the book, Zim responds in part. If you wanted to teach a baby a lesson, would you cut off its head? Of course not. You'd paddle it. There can be circumstances when it's just as foolish to hit an enemy city with an H-bomb as it would be to spank a baby with an axe. War is not violence and killing, pure and simple. War is controlled violence for a purpose. The purpose of war is to support your government's decisions by force. The purpose is never to kill the enemy just to be killing him, but to make him do what you want him to do. Not killing, but controlled and purposeful violence. But it's not your business or mine to decide the purpose of the control. It's never a soldier's business to decide when or where or how or why he fights. That belongs to the statesmen and the generals. The statesmen decide why and how much. The generals take it from there and tell us where and when and how. We supply the violence. Other people, older and wiser heads, as they say, supply the control, which is as it should be. So notice the salient points in Zim's response. While he's surprised that the recruit doesn't know the answer at this stage in his training, he says that explicitly before this quote, he does not discourage Hendrick from asking questions or thinking. He treats it as a serious and reasonable question, which deserves a comprehensive, thoughtful, and respectful response about the role of civilian control of the military and the necessity for the military to train for something less than all-out high-tech warfare. So he's training a citizen, and he understands that he's training a citizen in addition to training a soldier. Now, I'll note, does that sound like a military dictatorship to you? Doesn't sound like one to me. But Zim understands and takes it as a serious question and gives him a thoughtful response to that. In Paul Verhoeven's Starship Troopers, on the other hand, Zim tells Hendrick to put his hand flat against a nearby vertical surface and with a deft throw of the knife pins Hendrick's hand in place. And while he's screaming with pain, the knife sticking out of the back of Hendrick's hand, Zim laughs and says something to the effect, you cannot push a button if you disable his hand. Or you cannot push a button if there's a knife sticking out of it or something like that. That's just sadism, pure and simple. I will say the movie did get Heinlein's view of equality of women largely correct, because despite the fact that there's a bunch of people that claim that Heinlein is misogynist because he doesn't let women be in the mobile infantry, those same people conveniently ignore the fact that he says, you know, most naval officers, or at least the naval officers that are pilots, are women because they're just better at the job. and that there's a lot, like we see 2 ship captains and they're both female and they both have female pilots. And Carmen, his friend from high school, joins the military and she becomes a pilot too. And so Heinlein gets the equality of women largely correct, even if parts of it, and like I said, I couldn't make it through the mobile infantry training, and I have the advantages of upper body strength, etc., that I get just based purely on the accident that I was born a guy. And so I have a hard time seeing whether very many women at all could pass through that. So let's talk, now that we've talked about it as a pretty bad translation of the book, let's talk about it as a movie in its own right. Some people really like this movie. More power to you. Some claim it's a brilliant satire. Okay, you go right ahead. If you want to believe that, I'm not going to argue with you. I think the problems with it are worse than that, but there's certainly problems with the Army. There's anything that looks like combined armed tactics. There's no air support. There's no tanks, no artillery. They basically just run around in a big mob. At one point, they literally form a circle around a target and shoot in towards the middle. And I don't even think the campfire girls exist anymore, but if they did and they were fighting the mobile infantry, I'd put my money on the campfire girls. There's equally bad problems with the Navy. They end up with multi-ship pileups in orbit just because they're stupid. Feeling perky is not an excuse to violate safety of flight issues. And plus, is any of that stuff consistent with a fascist society? I mean, it doesn't seem like anybody's really worried about getting in trouble for anything. There's lots of problems with basic science. But, overall, Hollywood always gets this stuff wrong. They do. Let me go back to the multi-ship pileups in orbit. People sometimes will point out when I say that there was a collision in the book. But you look at what happened in the book and you look at what happened in the movie. And what happened in the movie is they basically guaranteed they were going to have a collision. They're in this incredibly tight formation that if anybody twitches, they're going to have a collision. That's a lot different. Collisions happen, right? It's a lot different than if they happen because, hey, shit happens, versus you're guaranteed that you're going to have one because you're stupid. So this is especially surprising since Paul Verhoeven is actually a veteran. He was a Dutch Marine. But he just always seemed to get this stuff wrong. I suspect that he was drafted and didn't really pay attention when he was a Marine. So let's go on to the conclusion for this, which is what I call the big lie. Now, I've got 2 quotes here. Let me foot stomp that I don't endorse the author of either quote. I don't endorse Hitler as a source. I don't equate them by any stretch of the imagination. But the important part here is that Paul Verhoeven is just plain lying about this when he says the philosophy of Heinlein is in the movie. He didn't even read the damn book. And then they fundamentally changed a lot of things to make it fit the way that he wanted to do it. And I'm not saying Verhoeven is as bad as Hitler. I'm saying that Verhoeven et al. Are at best engaged in willful misreading of the book, and at worst are engaged in propaganda. Now, I actually agree with the aims of Neumeier and Davidson and Verhoeven when they made this. I don't have a problem with a movie that's anti-fascist. I don't have a problem with that at all. Paul Verhoeven lived, he's a Dutch citizen, or at least was a Dutch citizen. He grew up in the Netherlands. He lived through the Nazi occupation as a small child. Ed Neumeier is an Austrian and was born in 1955. So while he did not live through World War II, he was born 10 years after the war and lived in a part of Europe that had been front and center in this. And so, you know, I'm sure he heard all sorts of stories, and, you know, he lived in a society that was dealing with the implications of that. And so the fact that they wanted to write an anti-fascism book, I don't have a problem with. What I have a problem with is the fact that they took a book that had a very specific and useful message about civic duty, and they turned it into a caricature of itself. They didn't have to do that, but they did. So now I think I technically have a half hour left. So let me, first of all, let's see. Brant, are you back? Give me a yes or no or something. Okay. So our producer was having problems. I don't know if he can put me up, but what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to take a look through the comments in StreamYard and see if there's any. Okay, it looks like Merle is here. So Merle, I'm going to turn my camera on. Go ahead and put me up. Okay. All right. So let me see what the comments look like, and if there's any questions I can answer in the comments. Let's see. Somebody commented it's up to 5,267 ratings for Starship Troopers. So it got 12 ratings on the overnight, because I literally did it about this time yesterday, because I updated. That's when I updated my slides. Let's see. We talked about the blind paraplegic counting hairs on a caterpillar example. Peter Gold, who's a merchant mariner, so he knows about being at sea, says cook on a transport is hard in that you are away from home, poor pay likely, think draft era pay, and the ship could be shot at. So yeah, probably not as hard as being in the mobile infantry and getting to do the equivalent of beach assaults, but a lot of guys in World War II in the Navy died, and a lot of them were cooks and support personnel. So you're still putting your body in harm's way. Yeah, and somebody else made the comment about sounds like the claims about galley slaves, when in reality galley slaves are really kind of a fictional creation of the 20th century or maybe earlier. Everything that we've seen says that you didn't use slaves, because actually being in a galley, being an oarsman in a galley was a skilled position. Because timing was very important. It was considered to be skilled work. It's manual labor, but it's hey, it's back in ancient times. Everything was manual labor, and so they didn't use slaves for that. Somebody made the comment, this happens quite often in military court-martial proceedings. Particulars surrounding the offense often sway the punishment level. Makes a lot of sense to me. Jeff Beeler says, has anyone heard it was supposed to be a Warhammer 40,000 movie, but they did not get the rights? I specifically have not heard that, and I would be really surprised about that for a couple of reasons. One is I did not meet Ed Neumeyer, but I know a bunch of people who did, because there's a conference that I go to on a regular basis called the Connections Conference. And the Connections Conference, before I started going to it, before I started working at the Center for Naval Analysis, Ed Neumeyer was there. And so people I worked with talked with Ed Neumeyer, and that comment wasn't made. The other thing is it would be inconsistent with it being an anti-fascism movie. Or maybe not, actually, come to think of it. I could maybe see that. I've never heard anything about that. That hasn't been in any of the interviews I've seen. And I've basically tried to read them all. It's not been in any of the support material, etc. So maybe it's true, maybe it's not. Jeff Beeler also asked, would you say Verhoeven was against romancing military service? I think that's pretty clear. I think that is a case. Yeah, the movie's tactics are very 40K shoulder-to-shoulder mass attacks. That's true. I'm not willing to give them credit for even stealing it from 40K. I think they just basically didn't pay any attention to it. It's clear that, which is really funny, because it's clear that despite the fact that they have quite intensive training, you know, you sort of wonder what exactly did they learn in training, because they don't seem to be very good at this stuff. It's really kind of weird. And as is pointed out, the Connections 2021 conference starts tomorrow. It's going to be online. So if you go to connectionswargaming.com, you can get the information on how to attend the Connections conference remotely. And so Merle Robinson, who's currently functioning as the producer, is basically the guy who's making it happen. I'm helping him with that. There's also the Connections Online Conference, which I'm the founder of, and Merle was instrumental in making it happen back in the beginning of April. So that conference is largely available online. So if you want to see the lectures, etc., go to YouTube and do a search for Connections Online, and you should find it. Put it in quotes. Somebody else has a Connections thing out there. Put it in quotes, and you should find it. Any last minute questions or anything? I'm not seeing anything in YouTube. So with that in mind, I think I will go ahead and end it here. Thank you all for coming and spending part of your Sunday morning listening to me rant and rave about Starship Troopers. It's one of my favorite books of all time, if not the favorite book of all time. And I am honored that that you all came. So thank you all for coming. And I will hopefully we'll get a chance to do this again sometime. Thank you very much.